Well, welcome to part two of Yaffed's webinar, Uneducated. Today's topic is barriers to self-sufficiency, and my name is Ezra Capel. I'm professor of Jewish Studies and English and director of the Perlmutter Fellows Program at the College of Charleston. I'm the author of American Talmud, the cultural work of Jewish American fiction, and in partnership with my co-editor Jessica Lang, we just last month published the book Off the Derech. Today, I am joined by a distinguished group of panelists: Loser Twersky, an award-winning actor; Naftali Moster, the founder of Yaffed, which stands for Young Advocates for Fair Education; and Yomali Suero, the Economic Empowerment Program Manager at Footsteps. For all of our viewers, please be sure to watch part one of this series, which focused on the vital topic of barriers to higher education, and a recording of both parts of this webinar are available to view online at yaffed.org/events. We will have plenty of time today for a Q&A at the conclusion of our discussion. So if you have any questions for one or more of our panelists, please submit them through the Zoom chat feature. And I want to remind our panelists that to ensure an enjoyable webinar for all of our listeners out there, please mute yourself when you are not speaking. So by way of introduction, each panelist will state their name, their affiliation, and they'll tell us just a little bit about themselves and their background. Let's start with Loser Twersky.
Unmute. That's not my name. My name is not on mute. Hi, I'm Loser Twersky, and I'm an actor and a writer. I was raised in Borough Park. I went to Bells, later lived in Muncie, and that's basically the gist of it as far as the relevance to this.
Okay, well, great. Thank you for sharing that, Loser. Let's turn to Naftali.
Great. First of all, thank you, Ezra, for moderating this important panel. So my name is Naftali Moster, and I am the founder and executive director of Yaffed, Young Advocates for Fair Education. I attended Hasidic yeshivas my entire life, also Bells, actually, like Loser, and we happen to be cousins, some distant cousins. And when I discovered as a young adult the long-term handicap the lack of secular education has caused me, I had decided to form an organization to compel education officials to enforce the existing law, which requires non-public schools in New York State to provide an education that is, quote, at least substantially equivalent to public schools, meaning it could be better or it could be the same, but it can't be worse, right? So this is kind of like why I formed the organization and where I come into this conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Naftali, for sharing that. Yomali.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yomali Suero. I'm currently the Economic Empowerment Program Manager for Footsteps, but overall, I have been an HR professional for over 12 years, both in recruitment and just doing general career coaching overall. I have my bachelor's from Pace University in human resources. And I'm here today kind of to share the, I guess you could say, the outsider's perspective on what are some of the barriers that folks, especially yeshiva grads, are kind of facing at this time in regards to employment.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. My first question is for Loser here. I'd like you to tell us just a little bit about some of your struggles towards financial security and independence that you faced as a result of your limited secular education and perhaps your English language skills.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I forgot to say earlier, and to be honest, I just recently rolled out of bed, so maybe I'm not as sharp as I am at 8 p.m. So when I first left at, when I was 22 years old, I was trying to get a job in the outside world, and it's funny because, like, as a lot of people, I mean, Yaffed obviously is an education advocacy organization, and it's, for someone like me, I never ended up going to college or getting a GED or doing any of that, because I decided to pursue a career in the arts, which apparently you need no education and no morals either. But
That's
so
for another webinar.
yeah,
We'll-
but even when you're an artist, you know, and you need some kind of income, like a regular job. And I found from the beginning that I was, you know, I couldn't get anything. I mean, I was embarrassed, even to this day, you know, if I sometimes get to a point where I need to get a survival job, and I'm like, even 12 years later, like, what do I put on my resume? Now I had some professional work. I worked in fashion, and I've done other things. But even like education, what do you put down? You put down Yeshiva Torah's Chesed London, you put down Belzer Talmud Torah. I mean, like, who's going to know what that is, and what what skills do you have from having been to those institutions? And of course, in the beginning, you know, I spoke English a little bit better than some of my siblings and some of my classmates, but still I had a heavy accent. It's not just the language, it's also the the way you speak it professionally. Yeah, I couldn't get a job at Starbucks. I couldn't do anything. And this was before the gig economy, where now everyone can get work. But for me, the first 2 years, I was homeless. I was struggling. I was struggling a lot for the first few years, until my career took off a little bit. And it's obvious that if I had, you know, some kind of education, some kind of high school education, I mean, let alone a college education, it would be a lot easier for me. I mean, I don't know, it was 2009, so it wasn't easy for anyone to get a job at the time, and probably isn't now. But at the time, people, if you weren't overqualified for a job, you couldn't get any job.
Right.
And here you're talking about a guy who's 22 years old and basically has never held any like job outside the Hasidic world and has no skills. So I had no shot. I lived in a tent for a long time, and it was rough. It was rough. And again, it's not all the fault of my lack of education, but there's no question that that it contributed to it. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, of course, the timeliness of your comments right now. We are in another economic downturn, of course, due to COVID and so many difficulties right now. And so you're right about lack of education is not going to be helpful in a difficult economy to try to find employment. So thank you so much for sharing that story, Loser. Naftali, maybe you could share some of your experiences with us.
Sure. So I was basically on my own at the age of 21. I had no education, no income, and no skills. So for a while, I lived in a dorm with other young adults who actually came to the US for like an English language immersion program. And I, the American in the building, was the one with the least knowledge. No knowledge about the world in general, but also no knowledge of American culture and history, even compared to those immigrants or students who came here for that program. I was on the job market for a while, and let me just pause and say, I didn't have the concept of a resume or like going through the job application process. There was no preparation for that sort of thing in yeshiva. So I came in, completely. In addition to not having the skills, I also didn't know how to go about, seeking a job. It's not like people around me growing up didn't have jobs, but us, students, children in the schools were never kind of, prepared for that. So every day I would look through the classifieds of various newspapers, and I didn't feel like I had even just enough English skills, let alone any other advanced skills for any decent job. I, of course, tried to apply for a job at B&H, the photo store that employs a lot of Hasidim, but I did not get even the entry-level job I was after. After a while, I was caught up in one of these MLM schemes, the multi-level, whatever you call it, schemes, and it was some sort of insurance company. And, it's not like an entirely fake job or business, but, they require you to spend your money to set up sort of like a shop within their business. And so here I was, unemployed and without any real prospects. And instead of earning money, I was actually spending money to one day, maybe I'll be able to, you know, make a small percentage off my sales. So out of desperation, there was one time I even kind of like offered myself to participate in some sort of like lab experiment that I didn't understand the concept really what it was, but I do know it involved some sort of injections. And I had no clue. I was like, you know, it's done in the university, it's probably safe and they pay money. And as long as they would offer that, I would have some sort of income. I was lucky that the woman at the desk was basically, she realized that I had no clue what I'm subjecting myself to. And she basically sent me to go away. I was working with an agency at the time to help me find employment. I remember they wanted to help me get a job as a security person in a building in Manhattan. There was this firm that offered to train you for free and then employ you, find you a placement and employ you. You would get decently paid, $16 an hour, if I remember correctly. But the notion at the time that I, a scrawny little guy who, let me remind you, didn't pick any gym or sports as a child either, was going to protect the building in Manhattan. You know, Manhattan is not something we had visited as children. It was like taboo, right? So the only thing I knew it was that it's so terrible, it's disgusting, like in terms of like spiritually, and then I knew about 9/11, but that's the extent of it. And I'm like, I'm gonna protect a building in Manhattan. So I turned down that job, and ultimately I accepted a job working in a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, basically where I was schlepping boxes all day long. And shipping them out. It was a very depressing realization that I was the top of my class in Judaic studies. I'm a smart kid, you know, or I was a smart guy. I could have done so much. I had hopes and dreams to pursue a degree. I wanted to become a PhD in psychology. And here I am schlepping boxes, you know, all day long, you know, in a dangerous neighborhood, doing the most meaningless thing. I mean, not to put down anyone who has to work in a warehouse, but it was just something that the cognitive dissonance between what I felt I was able to do versus what I was stuck doing was really painful. So that's kind of like sort of a little bit of a snapshot of my own struggles after leaving yeshiva.
Right. Well, thank you so much for sharing those experiences with us, Naftali. And maybe, Molly, maybe we could follow up. One of the things that Naftali mentioned was about he had no resume, no ability to write a resume and what to put on a resume. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of those challenges to financial security and independence that your clients face on a daily basis that you see in your practice.
Right. So in terms of, there are many, but the main ones that I, just to name a few, and I'm sure we'll dive deeper in as we go along in the conversation, but one of them is just basic lack of English, reading skills and writing skills that me and you could take that for granted as far as filling out an application at McDonald's, but when you can't read what it is that you're trying to fill out, that automatically discourages you, even if you don't have a resume, because there are jobs out there. Well, yeah, you can walk in there, you don't need a resume and you can get that job, but you still have to fill out some kind of paperwork. And in looking at something and you have no idea what you're reading, right, is already frustrating. And there's a certain element of shame that has been shared with me about that. So that's one thing. Knowing what a resume is, period, is something relatively new, because it, from my understanding and what's been shared with me from the clients, is that within the community, resumes and all the formalities that come along with applying for a job in the secular world don't necessarily apply within. Just facts. They don't have to do all of that. It's less work. But then when you find yourself in a place where you can't find an opportunity within the community, you need to come outside, you find yourself ill-equipped. You don't know what a resume is. You don't know where to search for it, how to search for it, what to say when they ask you just the first question. So tell me about yourself. That question alone, They're like, well, what do you want to know? I don't even know what to tell you. So that's part of it. And then of course, other things that kind of come along is like work experience. Like some of the clients that I've had have had experience within the community doing schlepper jobs, like Neftali had mentioned, or maybe other more advanced types of roles, but some of those roles don't necessarily translate into the secular world. And then having to put that on a piece of paper to show it to somebody, hoping that they understand, like, unless they know about Jewish culture and the Jewish religion, customs and traditions and philosophy, some of those things on that paper is not going to make much sense to them.
Right.
And if you don't have a proper translator, someone to translate all of that experience into the secular world somehow, you know, you might as well be handing them nothing.
Right.
Right.
Just to add to that,
Yeah.
I mean, there is a, in the Hasidic community, like when I was, before I left, if you wanted a job, you ask someone, you basically make it known that you are looking for a job.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and your father will happen to meet someone at Shacharis and tell him, oh, by the way, you got something for my son. And then you just get a job. And
We call that networking.
yeah, well, yes, we call it networking, you know. But you know, back then we call it shachas mincha marav, you know. And you get a job. The idea of a resume and presenting yourself, it just doesn't exist. So the whole concept is completely foreign to us.
Right.
That's the first thing. And the second thing is, like, the thing about manual labor and schlepping work, as we call it. You know, Rodriguez, the great singer, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, you know, there's no shame in hard work. There's no shame in being poor. And all that. The issue with that is that that, you know, we live in a country where there's so much opportunity, and somehow we have to you know, apologize to ourselves for still doing the work that our grandfathers did in 18th century Poland. It's like, well, work is work. Well, yes, work is work, and we're all happy to have work and to put food on the table. But we live in a country with such immense opportunity, or at least used to be, and here we are, like, basically, you know, very talented people who can be so much more, doing, you know, menial work. You know, is it menial or menial? I can never pronounce that word.
Menial.
Well,
Yeah.
you know, just to comment on that, right? Those are excellent points, Loser. And Naftali was talking about, it's the dissonance, right, between what people who don't have these barriers, right, are capable of doing. There's nothing wrong. I will agree with you on that. There's nothing wrong with being a schlepper, right? We've all schlepped at one point or another and done jobs, and work is work, right? But if you are capable, and of course, when we talk about illiteracy, these are not people who are illiterate. In fact, they are extremely literate, but just
Right.
not in with English language skills, just not, and they're studied, as Naftali said, right, and Loser as well. You were spending many years studying in the base medrash, and very aware, very, you know, most folks have a tremendous amount of knowledge and scholarship about the religious subjects, but you're in, you have this barrier once, and by the way, that networking system also works very well within the system itself, but, you know, when you need to get beyond that, that's when these barriers are there, right?
Lots of anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, I got my first apartment through a network, you know, of that way. Oh, you know of something? My son wants to move to the city, you know, maybe you know of something. I mean, networking is fantastic, and the Jewish community has used it from the very beginnings, right, in America to get started and get moving. But this on a larger scale, right, that can only go so far. And once you need, once that network is failing individuals and they need to go outside, then they are limited, right? That dissonance between what they may be capable of doing and what their educational barriers are stopping them from achieving, right?
Right.
So,
And just
If I
adding
may-
to that, though,
Yes.
just adding to that, there are some individuals that have acquired, like, have done jobs that are transferable in the secular world. But what's the problem? There was never really any value placed on academic credentials. So they could be applying, they could apply, let's say, to a controller job. They've done that within the community. But when, let's say, they don't find that opportunity there and they have to come outside, they'll look at this resume and say, oh, you have this experience, but there's no college degree at the bottom, not even something to say high school diploma obtained. Some companies may give you leniency on that, but it's very rare. And in order for you to do that, you would have to go back to school. But what happens with that? In order for you to even access secular college, university education, you need to have a high school equivalency. And what does that mean? English, math, sciences, social studies. You have to pass the task exam. So even before they reach that, they have to take a placement test, and that by itself is a nightmare if you don't have the proper tools to get there.
Absolutely, Yamali. You know, my father for many years ran an alternative high school in Brooklyn for students, right? In New York State, you have till age 21 to pursue your education. And for a variety of reasons, people who had hit, you know, very difficult times in their lives, if they had to drop out of high school, they could come back and get their high school equivalency degree with my father in Brooklyn, in Bushwick, actually. And he ended up catering to a large number of yeshiva graduates and people who were trying desperately to pursue their education, didn't have those skills and needed to start basically at ground zero to take their high school equivalency exams. And so, you know, what we're saying is that, you know, if they had these skills all along, right, it would give them so many more options to pursue and so much more success within America itself. So I agree wholeheartedly in your comments there, Yomali. Let's turn back to Loser here, and then maybe Naftali, about how you were able to perhaps, or what have you done to be able to overcome some of these challenges that you have been faced with through these educational deficiencies?
Well, I got lucky, to be honest, a couple of times. I had a couple of things of luck. First, I mean, now, obviously, you know, it's a long time has passed and I figured out how to structure my life in a way where I can pursue what I love and make a living. As you can see, you know, this is my casa, and it has wheels, and I'm currently in the middle of nowhere in Wyoming, I think. So this is now, but in the beginning, it's an interesting story. Like I you know, right after I left, I was at a fundraiser, and I met a very wealthy guy by the name of Steve Eisman, who was just a big Jewish donor, and we struck up a conversation, and he told me, he's like, you know, you're a smart guy, you're a talented guy. If you want, I'll give you a job at my hedge fund. And this was like 11 years ago. And I said, you know, I'm afraid that if I take the job at your hedge fund, I will forget what I was pursuing, that I wanted to be an actor. I'm afraid I'm going to make so much money that I'll forget that I want to be an actor. So I'm not going to take the job. And he respected that. And then a couple of years later, I had Felix and Mira come out, this film. And that year it was Canada's entry for the foreign language Oscar. So like I almost went to the Oscars. So I saw him again at another fundraiser, and I went up to him and I said, by the way, Steve, you remember that time when you told me and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh yeah. I was like, guess what? This year I almost went to the Oscars. And he looked me straight in the eye and said, like, yeah, but guess what? We did. Because they made a movie about his life, The Big Short, and it did win an Oscar, blah, blah. Anyway, but I had several things like that where people offered me jobs. They liked me and they thought I was smart and they thought I'm capable and they offered me a job, which is how I ended up working for Duncan Quinn for like 5 years in fashion, and I did very well in that industry. Even though when I walked in the door the first day, I knew zero about fashion. I not only didn't know anything about fashion, I let alone about high fashion, what he was selling, but I didn't really know how to like interact with the kind of people who buy that kind of $5,000-$6,000 suits. But in general, I would say that it was luck. You know, I got lucky with Duncan Quinn. I got lucky with certain acting roles that that helped me survive. And to this day, even like if I have a dry spell with work, I would still get in my car and do Uber or Postmates or DoorDash. You know, I have no shame in that, and I do what I have to do. But there's no question that if I had a better education, I mean, I did work at B&H as well. Even after I left, I worked at B&H. But yeah, if I had a better education, you know, even if I felt like this stuff is for me, to this day I'm like I would open it. I read a lot, but like not like textbooks or anything like that. And I'm like, what is this stuff? Like, why do I need to start here? I already know 1 + 1. I already know like this stuff. Like, why just tell me what I need to know? You know, like I'm 35 years old. I don't have time to sit down in a class and like and now like, all right, start from the beginning. Right. No, just tell me what I need to know. You know, in a way, like I guess in that way, I remained Hasidic. You know, I'm like.
And by the way, let's for those listeners out there who have not seen Loser in One of Us or in Felix and Meira, wonderful films and fantastic roles for you, and thank you for all of your work in that regard, Loser. So, Naftali, maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the ways in which you have tried to overcome some of these educational deficiencies.
Sure. So I worked in a warehouse for 4+ years, and I was earning, you know, close to minimum wage. You know, it was, Loser mentioned, you know, there's no shame, and you know, these are great jobs. You know, there was no shame. I mean, I guess not too much shame. There was that dissonance that I mentioned before, but and in some ways, I miss it. You know, it was the job that required me to move around and do exercise. The last few years, you know, the job that I have is basically sitting in an office and sitting in meetings and all of that stuff. There's an element, of course, that I miss about it. But that being said, without a doubt, it was a low paying job and low stimulation, intellectual stimulation. And that was just very, very painful to me. But during that time, I was going to school evenings and weekends. I was hoping to pursue a degree in psychology. Now, I can go in separately and talking about my struggle to get into college, which was tremendous. But ultimately, I managed to get in, and I was doing well. I was very dedicated, but it was a part-time thing, so it dragged out for a while. When I finished with my BA in psychology, I had wanted to pursue a PhD in psychology or a PsyD, but that would require for me to go to do a GRE exam and to do well, right, in order to get into any half-decent school. And again, this is where earlier knowledge comes into play. It's one thing, you asked me about psychology, I just finished studying it, I was doing well, that's one thing, but it requires it requires existing knowledge, and it also has an element of time. You see, some of us, we are able to learn and we're able to articulate ourselves to some extent, but when you're put on the spot and you got to respond about something, you know, that is not in your first language, and you only learned it, you know, very late in the game and things like that, you're not able to kind of like go in there and, you know, pluck it out and remember it and use it. So to this day, look, I settled. I went to get a master's in social work. I mean, again, I'm proud of that accomplishment, and I did well. But the fact is, people don't realize, and they often say, "Look, you've succeeded, you've done well for yourself." But again, when you compare it to my capabilities, I've come up short again and again. And to this day, I'm already, you know, I'm 34. I've been out in the world, so to speak, for 14 years almost, or 13 years. And to this day, I come upon so many different obstacles and things that it is expected that I would know, and I simply don't know. You know what I mean? So most of the times you're able to kind of like smile along, nod along, and be like, oh yeah, sure. And then it like totally goes over your head, but the other person doesn't realize it. But there are occasions where you're just stumped. It's something you actually need to know in order to continue this meeting or continue, you know, a conversation. And you know, and this is for me, which is like, you know, I'm in the kind of social science world and advocacy. But imagine if someone who's in a very technical environment, you can't just kind of nod along and let something seriously, you know, fail. So it's a struggle even for people who, so to speak, you know, are fitting in and they've managed to pick up the English language and so forth. For many people, I'm sure Yamali can speak a lot more to it more broadly, but I think a lot of the struggles persist. And I've encountered this in my work when I speak to people who, again, on the surface, they're like, oh, they've made it, they've succeeded, and they tell me how much it's a constant struggle.
Yeah, thank you for that, Naftali. Yeah, Molly, within this structure that we're talking about, there are differences, right, between the secular subjects that are taught to men and women, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the differences there. And of course, we're talking about how many of these educational lack of secular education has affected, let's say, male graduates of many different yeshivot. But what about women, which are often given, particularly in Israel and elsewhere, they are given more options to more education? Are they in a better position to get jobs in the outside world?
I have to say, in my experience, versus the males, the women have definitely stepped up their game in terms of education, because they realize some of them are the breadwinners of their house. So yes, they can beat themselves up psychologically, like, oh, I should have been here. I should have known this. If I only just, if it was earlier, if I was younger, because a lot of them are mothers and, they don't have time to beat up on themselves. They just, what do I need to do? Where do I need to go so I can make this money? That is the mentality. And so what they've done is, like, they've had the gumption to go out and get the education they need, even if they didn't learn it before. But they will find a way to get the tools that they need in order to excel in the careers that they choose, because they are the breadwinners of the house. They have to. And not for everyone, but for the majority of the clients that I've seen, yeah, I would have to say overwhelmingly so. Now, the biggest issue, though, is being able, especially now, is the childcare issue. Is definitely hit them a lot harder than most, because it's like you have to work, but you also have to find childcare for your children and make sure that, they're receiving the education that they need. And that's been a really big challenge, especially if you have to work from home and also be overseeing the children if they don't go to a yeshiva, per se.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, these many of these differences, I would just say, my own background, having been raised Orthodox, but in a Jewish day school, which did have secular subjects taught, I think what there's so many different opportunities that you have, right? And what we're hearing is that it's not impossible to catch up if that is your main focus, and you don't have all of these other responsibilities, whether it's childcare or other responsibilities, which of course most people do have, which makes it that much harder to catch up. But if you are educated in both, Limudei Kodesh and in Limudei Chol, right, and the secular subjects and the outside world, then you have opportunities if and when you need them, right? And as we know, there are many people who do need to go outside the community to earn a living, right? And so we know that process, that dual curriculum process, works so well for so many people who are living what would be considered under any standards, Torah Judaism, right, in a Torah lifestyle, and yet don't have to overcome all of those same shortcomings in the secular world. It's just, and I think that's really what we're hearing here, right? Not that that this is just an awful lot to add. It's hard enough to make it, right, in America in any way, or anywhere for that matter. And now you're starting out at a major disadvantage when, in fact, you need to go outside. And this is not just for people who have left the community in its entirety, but for those who are within the community but need to earn a living outside of it. So this is not about leaving. It's about just having opportunities to support families and yourself, and having that sense of independence. Right? I see, Loser, you wanted. Oh, yes.
I was gonna say that it's not just that. Like I have two brothers who work in IT, and they they're self-taught. And my brother is he works on Splunk. I think there probably going to be like one person in the entire audience who knows what this is, what the technology is. but it's a very specific technology networking that he's very good at, and he keeps being asked by larger companies to join, and he's at B&H. The point I'm trying to make is that even if it's not necessarily academic, you know, even if it's just so people can put food on the table, so people can learn, and even people, maybe now it's a little bit more common than it was when I left, and I think it is, but when I left, like, even that was considered like, oh, what's that, family is weird, you know, their father works, like, if he wasn't working for a Jewish company, it'd be like, oh, that father works for some Goyish company with computers. It's kind of weird. And I think that's another element of it, and when it comes to work and education, is like, if you're gonna take away people's computers, you're gonna take away people's internet, you're gonna take away people's education, you're basically not gonna give them any of the tools at all that they could possibly use to survive. Then all you're leaving them is with schlepping jobs. And the real issue with schlepping jobs isn't the dignity, which, you know, there's no loss of that. It's really the upward mobility of it, you know. It's the income of it. Like, even now, even if you're working for $15 or even $20 an hour, if you got 8 children, you know, and you have you have the holidays coming up now, you know, there's no way, let alone having to, you know, to marry off a child, there's no way you can survive on that money.
Right. You know, hearing all your comments, you know, begs the question, though, how much of within the communities themselves, how much is this lack of access to the outside world, how much of that do you think is built into the system purposefully, right, in order to keep people in the system, and then just put people into certain jobs that are acceptable and others that are not? Maybe Naftali, do you want to address that one to start?
I'm gonna go 100%, but yeah.
Then we'll get back to you, Loser, on that for sure, and Molly as well.
You know, I'm often asked this question, and most people outside the ultra-Orthodox community kind of come down on that side, basically thinking, look, the leadership is doing this intentionally. I don't know if I agree fully. I do know that, yes, they don't want people to go to college. Yes, they prefer if people don't work outside in the world. Of course, if you do break out and you're successful, they're going to use you as proof that you can make it on the outside. That's definitely going to happen. But generally speaking, they discourage it and they don't make it easy. I just disagree, not that you've said that this is definitively the reason, but with those who say that they're intentionally trying to kind of like handicap people so that they're stuck within the community, I don't know if I agree. I think they just put the value of Judaic studies at such an extreme top priority that it's like, it doesn't even leave room for secular studies. It's like, well, you know, look, we have to train every single boy to become a rabbi. It's kind of like, you know, we don't want them to regret it that later in life that you didn't train them to be a rabbi. It's kind of like the reverse of what we're saying, right? To them, it's like almost like, oh my God, they're going to come back and say, how dare you deprive me of an opportunity to become a rabbi because you spent so much time on, you know, profane English and science, right? So they just feel like what's most important, both for your future as a Jewish leader, as a rabbi, as well as in heaven, you know, when you come up in heaven after, you know, passing away, is that you will have all this Torah study. The lack of education and all the consequences that come with it, in my opinion, are more a byproduct. Now, there are plenty of rabbis who will admit to you that that's an added bonus. That you come out there, you're stuck, and you're like, it prevents you from leaving the community and things like that. Of course, they ignore the obvious dynamic where many people actually leave the community because they didn't get an education, right? They feel betrayed and so offended when they realize their limited opportunities, and they're like, okay, where can I go and get an education? And inevitably, it leads them outside of the community. But I'm just saying that's, you know, generally speaking, if I have to say, you know, what's the bigger reason for why they're not providing these tools, it has more to do with just valuing Judaic studies to such an extreme, totally ignoring, for instance, Maimonides, the Rambam, who understood that you need a healthy balance, and plenty of other Jewish leaders who understood that you need that healthy balance, kind of like what you said before. There are plenty of yeshivas that manage to do so and understand it. And believe it or not, they all grow up Talmidei Chachamim, right? Learned people in Judaic studies, yet also able to support themselves. I have plenty of relatives from my wife's side who are from the Litvish community, lawyers, very common. And of course, unfortunately, it's deteriorating over there, the next generation of the Litvish kids. So that's the ultra-Orthodox, but not Hasidic, to the viewers who don't know. Unfortunately, we're seeing a decline in the secular education, and then kind of a shift to more dependence on government assistance, lower quality, lower jobs. And one thing that hasn't yet come up is higher rates of fraud, which inevitably, when you deprive people of an opportunity, but you throw them into a world where they need to earn a decent living, right? Like Loser mentioned, multiple kids, it's common sense. People are going to have to kind of do what they got to do to survive and to support their families. And I'm not the one making that up. The Talmud says, "Chayav adam lalamed b'no umnis," right? A father must teach his son a trade, and if he doesn't, it's as though he teaches him to steal. And it's common sense, right? You're going to put someone out there with zero opportunity, but with a lot of responsibility. They feel that obligation to do what they can do to make some money.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for responding to those questions. We've been getting questions from our audience, and I'd like to pose those to some of our panelists here. Let's see. One question here is for Yomali here. Can you give us some specific gut-wrenching or shocking stories without, of course, naming any clients, but that would help perhaps elucidate some of the issues, these very real challenges that people are facing as a result of their limited secular educational backgrounds?
I think, well, there are a few. But if there is one person that does come to mind, there's this general, at least from what's been shared, there's this general consensus: if you leave, you will fail. And so I think the first time I had the conversation with this person, the question that I asked them was, listen, fine, you can tell me all the traumas that you've been having, but what do you want? Because you have options, you have a choice in terms of what you want to do with your life. So what do you want to do? And in asking that question alone broke that person, because they're like, first of all, they're comparing themselves to everybody else and saying, at this age, I'm supposed to be doing this. I'm supposed to have this amount of money. I'm supposed to. I've been told. This is the way it's supposed to be. No one in my life has ever asked me what I wanted to do. And I felt that it was my responsibility to show them, well, let me show you. I'm not saying this is going to be easy. I'm not going to focus on the doors that are closed for you. Let's focus on the doors that are open. And I showed them. And we were working together, trying to get them to apply to jobs. This person didn't even know how to use a computer. We started doing a little bit of that work, right? But when it came time to actually go on an interview, like after we took out all their skills, presented it in a way that's digestible, we practiced and practiced and practiced. When they got to the door, when they got to the table, they completely panicked. And they just turned right around and left. And they couldn't even explain themselves. There was anxiety, imposter syndrome. There was so much going on in that person's mind. And before they even got to sit down and talk to anybody, they already convinced themselves that they cannot do it.
Yeah.
And then they decided not to look for a job in the secular world, to just stay in the community because it's easier. But to this day, I mean, I haven't been in touch with them recently, but to my knowledge, they're still working in that dead end job because they just don't feel like they themselves are their own stopper. No one is telling them. They themselves have convinced themselves that they cannot succeed unless they succeed the way they've been taught to.
Right.
I think that is probably one of the saddest things I have had to witness in terms of working with my clients now.
Well, thank you for sharing that very moving story, Omali. And you're there seeing these, trying to help people overcome many of these issues that we're discussing here, and it's such important work that you're doing. And thank you for sharing that with us. One of the things that, while you're speaking, really brought up for me is the notion, of course, that we're talking about these basic skills, but we are now in an economy, right, which requires so much more even than basic skills, right? To get a higher earning job, you need to have specialized knowledge and specialized skills and higher education. I know part one of this series dealt with higher education more specifically, but of course that is something here that is so important. You're talking about people who have the ability, right, to accomplish so much in a professional setting, and they're handicapped because they don't have the basic skills. And there's this tremendous divide. And I think this is what both Loser and Naftali were hinting at earlier, because actually you're spending so much time studying, right, and understanding about ancient text and doing scholarship and doing all of these things that should in fact set you up for success if you had the linguistic skills and the other skills in math and science and things of that nature. And yet you're extremely limited with them only within this one way, within the community, right? Within a spiritual or holy text and studying of that. So I think there's this sort of real split here, right? That both Naftali and Loser are referencing here. Do you guys want to follow up on that? Any?
Oh, me or Naftali?
Sure.
Naftali, go ahead.
Loser, I could let you go first.
Oh, no, it's fine. Go ahead.
Well, I actually, I've heard the two of you mention before that these are highly literate individuals. And I think to some extent it's true, but depending on what you mean by literate. I could be literate in playing video games all day. I can know every video game in the world. I'll be literate in that sense, but I won't have any literacy that is transferable to the real world or to anything beyond video gaming, right? For instance, I had this very interesting experience that I think can capture, this issue, how things that you learn in Judaic studies, they're so limited to Judaic studies that it doesn't really transfer to the real world. So I was 21 years old and I was sitting at a Shabbos table with less like non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox people. So people who've gotten a better education, they spoke English. And it came up at that Shabbos meal that I did not know which direction is north, south, west, and east, right? The directions. And they taught me on the spot, right? W-E spells we, and that's, whatever. And okay, so I learned that. And in my mind for the next 6 years, I always assumed that north equals Mizrach. Mizrach is Mizrach, Tzafon, Darim, Marav is the Hebrew version of the directions. And I always thought Mizrach is north based on what I just learned. You tell me that north is up, right? Then Mizrach, which is where we've always learned, is up. The Beis HaMikdash, the temple was there. God is a Mizrach. When you pray, you got to face Mizrach. And it was always like the assumption that that's where Mizrach is. It's north. Fast forward 6 years, I'm in graduate school. I kid you not. My professor's name is Dr. Mizrahi or Professor Mizrahi. And she wanted to break the ice and she goes, when you hear the name Mizrahi, what comes to mind? And the whole class is quiet. Nobody raises their hands. A bunch of dorky social work students, okay? So finally, I'm going to be brave. Loser, calm down. Anyway, I raise my arm and I say, it means north. And this professor looks at me, gives me the most bizarre look, and she goes, what? No, it means east, but that's not my point. Where I was going with this was to see if anyone has heard of the fashion guy, whatever, Isaac Mizrahi. It was so humiliating, and it was just, I mean, it's fine. I get over these things a lot, and I had a lot of these in school. But the point is, you know, you would think that something that we've learned so much about, right? Where's the Beis Hamikdash? Which direction did they put X, Y, or Z? You would think directions is the one thing we would know. And the reality is, at the age of 21, when I would hear the radio talking about inbound traffic going inbound and outbound, that I had no clue what that was. And then when I finally learned that, and I still didn't know how it, how it relates to the Hebrew version of it. So my point is that most of what we learned in the Judaic studies is not transferable. And it's an important point because yeshiva leaders have been recently trying to make the argument that, look, our education is different, but it's similar, right? Substantially equivalent, right? So we may not learn a course on math, on trigonometry. I don't even know what that is, but right, we don't do courses on these, but it comes up in various places in the Talmud, and you just pick it up. But you don't. That's the point. You don't, and it's not transferable.
Right. Well, your story, Naftali, about not knowing which direction Mizrach is. I mean, of course, this is challenging geographically, but also in terms of Jewish knowledge, it would suggest that you never were exposed to the poetry of Yehuda Halevi, let's say, right? And there's so much of, that secular knowledge could help illuminate within Jewish texts and Jewish literature throughout the ages here. And so, I have to say that, my own background, having gotten an excellent education, both in terms of religious subjects and secular subjects, they enhanced one another throughout. I can't say it was always that case, but overall, and it really inspired me to want to go into a field like Jewish studies, right, and Jewish literature, to think about how we could combine the beauty of both of those traditions together in a way. And so I think that's really one of the things that we're arguing for here, right, and thinking about. And you mentioned about some of those Board of Education requirements. I think we have a question about that, but I didn't want to cut off Loser. I know who had something to add to this discussion right now. So.
No, not much. It's just to me, like the big the big issue here is an incredible amount of brain drain in that community. Mm-hmm. You have people who are capable of contributing so much to themselves and to the world, and they're stuck doing jobs that are just not equivalent to the level of skill that they really have, because like Yamali was telling the story, this incredibly heartbreaking story. It's like it's terrible that someone who clearly has ambitions and has goals and wants to do things in life is like, you know what? It's too difficult. I can't do it. I'm too far behind. And that's one. And that's one thing is the amount of brain drain. And
they were so close, though. That's the hard part. You're like, you're right here.
And they're not the only ones. And the other thing is, like someone mentioned in I don't know if it was in the chat or like you mentioned it just now about Jewish studies and about going to college for Jewish studies. And Naftali was talking about our education that we had. We get a terrible Jewish education too, by the way. We got a horrible Jewish education. Okay, there are goyim who know Tanakh better than us. I'm talking about evangelical Christians who actually truly studied Tanakh. They truly studied the Old Testament. They actually know Jewish history. Our Jewish history literally begins and ends at the Baal Shem Tov, more or less. Like we can tell you a lot of great anecdotal stories and moral stories about things that happened in the last 300-400 years. But when it comes to like when exactly did Rashi live and when was the Talmud written and any of that, we know nothing. We were never taught that stuff. And that is also a huge shame. We're not only not equipped to, we're not only not well educated in the secular world, we're not educated in the Jewish world. And we are given that information with such a high level of confidence. And to me, one of the biggest disappointments that I had after I left was meeting other Jews who have studied Jewish history, who do have knowledge of Jewish studies. And I come at them with like such confidence about halacha and about the rules and how we are doing it right. And they're like rolling their eyes and like, dude, you have no idea what you're talking about. You sound like Trump on hydroxychloroquine. You like, what are you even talking about? You know nothing, you know? So I think that is a huge shame. And someone brought it up in the comments or in the chat about, you know, us getting Jewish study class. And I think it is important. I think if someone wants to become a Jewish professional, become professional in Jewishness, you know, look at the Sascha Katz, you know, Rabbi Katz. I mean, this is a guy who studied in yeshiva and was a Daf Yomi Magachir and knows and probably thought he knew everything there is to know. And then the more he read and the more he got, I don't know. I don't know if that's a story, but I'm just making an assumption of how it happened. He must have gone and like read more and were like, oh my God, like Judaism is a lot more than that. So I think even that, you know, should be improved.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, Lucy, you raised the issue, of course, that there's a great variety, right, in terms of how even the subjects, the spiritual or the Limudei Kodesh are taught from one yeshiva to another, right? I think this goes to the heart of some of the work that Naftali is doing, right, to think about that. And so that, particularly in regards to, of course, the secular subjects, some are doing a very fine job in teaching this, and others it's almost non-existent. So a question from our audience, and this is for Naftali, could you talk about why you think that some yeshivas are resisting the calls for just these very basic requirements in their educational curriculums?
Well, I think I actually addressed it earlier when I pointed out that it has more to do with the emphasis on Judaic studies than it has to do with shunning the secular studies. And again, I think there's an element of both, but you know, to them, it's like, to those individuals who resist it, it's like, no. If we're increasing secular studies, we're automatically decreasing some. If we're increasing secular studies, we're automatically decreasing Judaic studies. And how can we do that? You know, so in other words, it's coming at the expense of the secular studies, and it just seems like something, you know, that you can't do. But another thing that I did not mention is that the reason this is able to kind of like get out of control, and people who are otherwise sane, reasonable people are like, no, don't make any changes, I think has a lot to do with the media in the ultra-Orthodox community. We're not talking about, and we're thinking of doing a panel on that in the future, but this is not a media that invites different opinions, right? It's not even just a biased media where they'll at least have a token person with an opposing view, where they'll give a quote to a person with an opposing view. No, here there's one opinion, and then they refer to, like us, for instance, as these rotten, disgruntled, crazy people, you know what I mean, who want to assimilate and cause a spiritual holocaust to the community. So even otherwise reasonable people, you know, when they don't have any exposure to the real discussions about this issue, they get so frightened off about this notion of making improvements to the education system that they don't want to hear about it. And that is part of the problem, right? But of course, there are so many different angles to this issue that it's really insurmountable to some extent to try to, you know, fully address it. You know, we're trying. We have our own kind of, we have a newsletter that we often mail to almost 20,000 Hasidic homes that kind of, you know, puts out our view of it and explains it from a Judaic perspective, why learning secular studies is important. But again, the majority of people, you know, as soon as we send out those newsletters, the community sends out robocalls and hangs up signs in the shul that everyone should rip it up, should not read it, and should make sure their kids can never reassemble it and retape it together, because God forbid anyone actually can entertain our perspective. So you have a few extremists who are kind of pushing this and preventing a discussion around this issue. And then you have even otherwise reasonable people kind of just going along because they're not even able to see what the positive side of improving education would look like.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you see, and this could open to all of our panelists here, do you see any positive changes in that regard that's coming from the incredible work of Yaffed and Footsteps and individuals who are trying to affect change in the community to give people opportunities to fulfill all of their great promise that they may have? Do you guys, I know what Naftali just said is very disheartening, but are there areas where things are changing and improving, or do you see this as just really not changing right now, and we definitely need to raise more awareness of this before there will be any substantive change for these tens of thousands of students, right, that are going to be struggling. They may not be struggling right now, but they will be struggling, down the line. And just anecdotally, I know, for example, my mother, who was for many years a reading instructor and teacher in the New York City public school system, she tutors a lot of kids from these yeshivot, who are incredibly smart, and they could rattle off 30, 40 Mishnayos by heart, right, in fourth, fifth grade, but haven't yet been taught, the ABCs, right? But they're whizzes at their Limudei Kodesh, right? And they just, and their parents want to make sure that they aren't going to be handicapped without an education, so they're getting them tutoring, but it's not being done in the schools. It's being done extracurricularly in this manner of tutoring and paying for it if they have the ability to do that separately. So, I mean, there are people who are, of course, in that world who recognize this, but what are some of those positive things? Because we're getting towards the end of this, and you've all worked very hard, I know, to help raise awareness of this issue. And so are there any positives that we could look at and see and maybe try to build upon as we move forward to try to address these many issues we've been discussing?
Well, I mean, as far as positive outcomes from that education system, I think it does. I don't know if it's the education system they have that's the positive side of it, but I think the cultural part of it, the thinking outside of the box, I think the creative thinking, creative problem solving, I think that is definitely a product of that environment in many ways. And you see a lot of times where from people, because they don't have the barriers of like professionalism, and because they don't have an education, because they don't have an MBA, they don't end up doing the thing that the MBA teaches you to do if you want to fix your business. They end up doing something completely outside of the box. So I think that I mean, I don't know if you can call it an upside, because you have to get that person to the point where they're running a business first. But if you get to that point and someone is already lucky, I think that is something that that scrappiness and that creativity, creative problem solving. I think that is probably the most generous I'll get.
Okay, thank you, Loser. Molly, did you want to add?
A couple of things, actually. I have seen, it's interesting enough that there are some folks that, despite the challenge of knowing that they're going to have to take some time to get an education, they still need money. So what I've seen is there's a buildup in resilience and persevering. Not that that wasn't always the case. Very, very resilient and persistent folks. But I've seen more people thinking about, being self-employed and what that looks like for them, and just taking control. Okay, I can't get a job in the secular world, can't find something in the community. Well, I'm just going to do my own thing. And these small self-employment start becoming little businesses, and then they start growing. That's something that I actually find a positive in all of this chaos. Is that they will find a way to kind of just move forward regardless. Mm-hmm. That's a positive that I've seen happening in lieu of getting an education and all the loopholes that they have to jump through to become financially independent.
Right. And Naftali, before we hear from you on this, I would just say that notion of resiliency within the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox world. I mean, this is such an important thing to understand, right? And the history, right, which these communities have evolved from, right? Most in the Hasidic communities, especially many of these communities were founded as just the remnant that remained from the destruction of the Khurban, of the Holocaust in Europe. And one can begin to understand, when you know that history, right, the insularity, the fear of the outside world, I think all of those things are so important in understanding this community and understanding perhaps the resistance to the secular world and the outside world. It makes perfect sense in many ways. I think what advocates like Naftali and Yomali and Loser and so many others that are trying to remove those impediments to success in the outside world are saying, so we certainly understand that, but right, also this is important now, right? And so maybe it's time where we kind of test that water a little bit and see where we can go and not shut out opportunity to so many people. So I think that was something that I was hearing, Yomali, when you were talking about that resiliency, right? And that idea of trying to make and trying to become a success. If one thing is blocked, you try something else, right? Until you get to where you need to be.
Right. And also the other thing is, I think now in this day and age, you have a lot more options than just the college route, which is something that I also advocate for. Like, I saw someone's comment in the chat, maybe they need to just treat, what's the Talmudic degree as maybe a liberal arts so that they can continue. And you know what? I have advocated for that in the sense I'm like, okay, Turo accepts those credits. So why don't you start there?
Right.
Okay? Or, there is a dual program where you can do both your high school, you could do the high school equivalency and be getting credits toward college. So that way you're not losing a year. Like, there's more options. You can do things online if you can't physically sit in a classroom. Absolutely. There are more options than just, you have to do it this way. Right. I think that's a positive of what's come around as well.
Right.
Today's day and age.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Yamali. Naftali?
Yeah, I don't want to hold it up much longer, but I think your question was, are we seeing a difference already, given all these years of advocacy? And, absent the pandemic, of course, which has really set a lot of people and organizations back for some time, I think we had been seeing a lot of progress. So first of all, on the city and the state level, the fact that they were investigating and kind of looking over the shoulders of the yeshivas, it forced many yeshivas to, even though much of it was a charade, but it did force them to ramp up their existing 90 minutes or so, better training for teachers, more content, even just a little bit of science and social studies. Like one year we did a panel discussion or a roundtable discussion around MLK Day, Martin Luther King Day. And the notion that we brought together public schools and public school kids and yeshiva graduates to highlight that growing up in New York City, we never even knew about MLK Day or who it was and any of that. And it was an opportunity to learn. As soon as we began promoting it, Pearls, our opposition, suddenly puts up pictures of Hasidic kids reading about Martin Luther King. And this, like, you could see that it's like a printout of a book stapled together. And so just having these discussions is pushing them in a certain direction where they have to take it a little more seriously. Parents are beginning to rumble. If you're in some of these Hasidic WhatsApp groups, you could see people are beginning to speak up a little bit more. And I think it's applying a lot of pressure. Now, on this policy level, of course, it's been stalled because of the pandemic. But I do hope that as soon as things go back to resembling a little bit of normalcy, that the state will once and for all pass these new regulations, which would basically outline a better enforcement mechanism of this century-old law and would usher in a whole new era where, yes, you can have both a full Jewish education alongside a full secular education, and we would see the results quite swiftly. Right now there's a lot of poverty in the ultra-Orthodox community, and again, this is not me saying it, it's the UJA study, community study of 2012, and hopefully this all would be impacted with a better education.
Well, thank you so much for those comments, Naftali. Thank you, Loser. Thank you, Yomali, for joining us. We've gotten dozens of questions on our chat, and unfortunately, we don't have time to answer all of them. We are at our 75-minute limit here, but perhaps we could have a follow-up panel down the line and answer some of the many very interesting questions and important topics that we weren't able to get to today. But I really want to thank our very distinguished panelists today for joining us. And hopefully you guys could go and check out part 1 of the series as well on the website and Take care, everyone. Thank you all for joining with us today.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much for having me. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.